Hello everybody and welcome back to Phil's Corner. Today's episode is a fun one because I'm going to be answering the question, which league in the world is the best for football shirts? I've often pondered this question myself and I've been asked this a few times as well, so I thought it would be fun to look at this together. I've put together my own top 10 list and I'll be running through that today. We'll be talking about not just classic shirts but the modern shirts of these various leagues too. And I'm sure you've all got your favourites. Maybe some of you collect from certain leagues. You'll have to see where I put them on this list. Before I go any further, please subscribe if you are new to the channel, or maybe you've been watching videos for a while but you've not subscribed. Being a subscriber is really huge for the growth of the channel. And of course, if you're enjoying the content, you'll simply know when I go live for streams, when new videos like this come out. So be a subscriber. And if you want to go that extra step, you can also support me on Patreon. There's some great benefits to being a patron, and you can join what is a growing community. The link to my Patreon and some more information is there in the description. And I also want to say that I'm going to be bringing back my Q&A slot. We used to do this at Phil's Corner. At the start of every main episode, we'd do a Q&A, and I want to do that again. So many of you will know how this works, but leave a comment. Ask me anything you like. It could be about shirts. It probably will be about shirts. But even if it's something else, I'll pick out my favourite 5 questions at the start of the next episode. So leave a comment. Maybe it's about this episode. Maybe you want to debate and argue your case for a certain league. Or maybe you just want to ask, is this a good deal? Where can I find this shirt? What's your favourite shirt from X league? So leave a comment, guys, and I will answer my favourite 5 at the start of the next main Phil's Corner episode. But let's get to this list now. I've got a top 10 for you, and we're going to do it in reverse order. We'll start in Argentina. Now, of course, if you talk about Argentinian football shirts, you have to talk about Boca Juniors and River Plate. Many of you know I have a real passion for Boca Juniors shirts. And really, I think this is the most aesthetically pleasing derby, I would say, in world football. Of course, it is an amazing derby for many reasons. The fans, the stadium, the immense passion that surrounds that derby, the Super Classico. But Boca Juniors and River Plate shirts are incredible. They really are. So consistent, the colours are so evocative. I think, again, seeing those two clash on the pitch is so exciting. And whether you're a casual collector or someone who's a bit more hardcore, those two teams represent two of the best teams in world football when it comes to shirts. And there's many other clubs too. Racing are great if you like your kind of Argentina vibes on the club scene. But I would say the league is a little bit top heavy. And a few leagues actually in this list, and many of the leagues that missed out, were very top heavy in terms of the top teams being very good for shirts and some of the other teams being less exciting. I think Argentina is an example of that, but the Boca and River shirts are so good that they really have to be, I think, in this top 10. But yeah, Argentina, the Primera Division, a lovely league for shirts, especially because of the Super Classico kits. Staying in the Americas, but moving north now, we have MLS. Now, in many ways, the story of MLS is in 2 parts when it comes to kits. At the start of MLS, we had one of the most exciting periods for kit design, and 90s MLS shirts are top draw. Many collectors now as well hunt after some of these 90s designs because they are so wonderful, and they're not the easiest to get hold of either. And for me personally, I love the Nike designs. There were a few other manufacturers too, but the Nike MLS shirts are so good in my eyes. They really are the peak of that kind of late 90s period where designs weren't necessarily the most crazy from a pattern perspective. It wasn't as sort of busy as maybe the early 90s, but you still had some great approaches to colour, and some of the really wonderful MLS designs were the ones which just had really strong colourways and maybe some good use of pinstripes or other kind of colour blocking. And of course in MLS you also had some great examples of team names on the front as sponsors, or in the sponsor position I should say, and those were really exciting as well. And incidentally, in my last video, which was talking about the shirts that I added to my collection, the community section at the end, I showed you some people who had picked up some great 90s MLS shirts. So there's another plug for another video which you can check out. But MLS really was one of the best for shirts. Sadly, in the modern era, MLS shirts have been a bit lagging behind, and unfortunately you have to look at the league-wide deal with Adidas and say that that hasn't been good for kit design as a whole. That's not to say there aren't good modern MLS shirts. And indeed, there are still some gems to be found. I think in general, things are picking up a little bit. I think of something like the Seattle Sounders, a Jimi Hendrix shirt, which is a wonderful example of creativity. But yeah, I wouldn't say modern MLS is anywhere near the standard of 90s MLS. And a lot of these other leagues that are higher on the list are a bit more consistent. So MLS, as I say, is sort of a tale of two eras. But the 90s was so good that, again, it is strong enough to put it in this top 10 list. Now, next up, we have one of the biggest leagues in the world when it comes to the quality of football and certainly the viewership and things like that. We're talking about La Liga. So number 8, again, maybe slightly earlier in this countdown than you would expect to see. The league, which has El Clasico, Real Madrid, Barcelona. From a shirt perspective, I don't think La Liga really matches its pedigree on the pitch. When it comes to shirts, I actually think the Liga's strength was really in the noughties. So we're talking kind of the mid to late noughties, even the early 10s. Clubs like Valencia and Atletico Madrid had amazing shirts with Nike. And this was a bit nostalgic for me to put La Liga on this list. But I loved some of the Total 90 designs and the later Nike designs that we had for clubs like Valencia and Atleti. I think for me, that was an exciting time where, again, in that period of shirts, I often looked to some of the clubs in La Liga. And of course we should also talk about Barcelona, because again, from a shirt perspective, they're one of the most interesting clubs. Such a huge club who also are quite daring when it comes to shirts. And in the modern game, though some of the kits have been hit or miss, I do often look forward to Barcelona. Real Madrid, though not as much to my personal taste, of course are still great value as well. If you did want to jump back to the 80s and 90s, there was a lovely period as well with Hummel and Real Madrid, and you know how much I love Hummel. That was a really wonderful period, which was certainly very strong at the time. So yeah, I think this is an example really where the pedigree of the league doesn't necessarily match the shirts. Some of the other quote-unquote big leagues are a bit better for shirts, I would say. But this is one I'd really like to hear your thoughts on. Do you like shirts in La Liga? Are there any that I should have picked out? Do you think they should have been higher on this list? Do let me know in the comments. But they've come in at number 8 on my top 10. At number 7, we have Liga MX, the Mexican league. And this is a league which I think is rising in quality year on year. Let's start with what the league is most famous for. And I would say a club like Club America really exemplify what makes the Mexican league so exciting. From a colorway perspective, a design perspective, Club America are one of the premier teams for shirts in world football, I would argue. They've had some of the biggest manufacturers work with them, Adidas before, and they have some amazing Adidas designs in the 90s. More recently, Nike have worked with Club America and given some great bespoke designs and really interesting creative shirts to the club. But it's not just about Club America. You can also look at a team like Puma's, one of the most iconic designs in shirts, that giant Puma head, which has been used on countless designs, is wonderful every year. Even though you know what's coming, you get something quite interesting every year, and that is exciting. I think in the world of shirts, those consistent designs, we talked about Boca and River at the start for Argentina, I really like that in shirts, and seeing how brands play around with that idea which a club has and which they stick quite traditionally to. In the modern game though, I'm really excited by a brand like Charlie, and I think if I was to pick a rising star in the last couple of years, it would be Charlie. Charlie, a Mexican manufacturer who have been doing such good work. And although they have started to branch out into other countries, really it is in Mexico where you'll find Charlie's best work. I absolutely love some of the more recent work that they've done for various clubs. And they do these really cool themed collections. I mentioned the wrestling themed shirts in my What I'm Buying video last week. So again, I look to Liga MX now, not just for the Club Americas and the Pumas of this world, but also some of the other designs that we're seeing for various clubs in the league. There's also a bit of a charm in my eyes for the heavy sponsorship we see on some of these shirts. And this is something which is true of a few divisions in this top 10. But I actually quite like sometimes the excessive sponsorship. It's not necessarily good for the aesthetics of the shirt, but it reminds me of a time when I was growing up and I would be obsessed with these shirts that you'd see from a league like Mexico. And you'd look at them and see all these brands that you've never seen before plastered on a shirt. To me, it was quite novel, quite exciting. And yes, it does sometimes get in the way of a design, but I kind of like that. And I still like that now as a collector. I recognise that's maybe a bit of a controversial opinion, but I hope some of you share that sentiment. But that's Liga MX in at number 7. Now for number 6, we're back in Europe at Ligue 1. And Ligue 1 for me is a consistent division with a number of teams that produce good shirts. This isn't just about PSG, and actually PSG for many years weren't really that exciting for shirts. I will start with them though, because I do want to mention the 90s PSG era and the very modern PSG Jordan era, if I can put it like that. If we talk about 90s PSG first, they are almost as good as 90s Dortmund, which many people consider to be the cream of the crop when it comes to shirts. But for me, PSG had almost as good designs. It was in that early 90s period where we had Nike exploding on the scene. And I shouldn't forget Lyon as well, because they also were with Nike for a period in the 90s. So that, again, in the golden era of Nike, French clubs were very much in that mix as well. But also in the modern game, PSG have contributed in a huge way to the shirt world, and we could talk particularly about the PSG Jordan collection as being emblematic of the modern shirt era. Things like collaborations, which are becoming more and more popular. PSG Jordan, I think, is the best example of that. Whether you like the whole PSG Jordan partnership or not, you can't argue with its impact. And we're seeing that with a number of clubs around world football. Outside of PSG, I mentioned Lyon before, but I also want to mention Marseille. No surprises here. You guys know how good Marseille shirts were. And again, it's the consistency for me. This isn't just about the retro Marseille kits. Of course, the Adidas Marseille shirts were some of the best that Adidas had in that kind of early 90s period, the Adidas equipment era. Marseille consistently had some of the best shirts then. But in the kind of late noughties, early 10s period, which is a bit of an underappreciated era for shirts, I would say, I think they were actually the best in that era, because you had some really, really good uses of the latest Adidas templates. And this is from the kind of tech fit full motion era, which is really interesting from a construction perspective. Many people don't think about that era for shirts, but I would say, again, look at Marseille shirt history. Some pretty wild colorways can be found there, alongside some more reserved designs. But I do love what Adidas did with Marseille. And again, Marseille are one of the clubs in world football I really look to for shirts. Before I go any further, I should also mention Saint-Etienne. Saint-Etienne had an incredible range of kits, working with brands like Lecoq Sportif. Many people have a real love for these shirts, and I am one of them as well. In that kind of 70s, 80s period of football shirts, we saw some real developments. And if you're into the kind of more retro aesthetic, of course, you have to talk about a club like Saint-Etienne. So some of those shirts which had the tricolour, the French flag, detail on the cuffs and collar, to the giant Super Telly sponsor that came later, they're a wonderful club for shirts. And yeah, Liga, a very strong division. I think even as I've talked about them now, I'm thinking maybe I should have bumped them up a bit more. I really do like the division for shirts. But now we come to our top 5, the best leagues in the world for football shirts. And next we have the Bundesliga, so another huge league in world football. I did give a bit of a nod in the last slot, didn't I, talking about 90s Dortmund. It's almost become a bit of a cliche in the football shirt community about how good 90s Dortmund is, or rather how much people rate 90s Dortmund. Whether people actually like it or not is another question, but I really do love 1990s Borussia Dortmund shirts. I think for me, you have to look beyond the hype, and I know that's difficult again, and I'm one of those people who very much peddle the hype, if you like, but I think this is an exciting era for football shirts when Nike came onto the scene and really pushed the boat out with computer-aided design. Many people rightly herald Drake Ramberg, one of the Nike designers who really became the face of this revolution. And these shirts have stood the test of time. It's not just about the luminous yellow colour, although I loved that luminous shade. But again, it was the way that the patterns were created. It was the way that we saw some of these ideas which had started to come to fruition in the 80s really explode onto the scene. And whilst Dortmund are maybe the poster boys, and I would say that of any era, of any team, it is a personal favourite of mine, other clubs in Germany have done great things. You can look to a club like Borussia Mönchengladbach. Their 90s shirts were great value. Or even a club like Werder Bremen. I used to love some of the Werder Bremen shirts we saw in the noughties growing up. Some of the Kappa designs, which are pretty crazy, but I used to enjoy them nonetheless. One of the other things I love about Bundesliga is that you've also got some of the Oktoberfest shirts that you see, the Carnival shirts that you see from various clubs. You think of someone like Mainz, who have done some amazing Carnival-themed shirts, which is some of the most fun designs that you see in the modern game. Or you've even got a club like 1860 Munich. Again, they've done some great Oktoberfest shirts. And of course, the 90s 1860 Munich shirts were wonderful too. There's many good things to be found in Germany and in the Bundesliga. But I think the strength of 90s Dortmund is really what separates it for me above some of the other leagues. That's really why I'd say they're in the top 5. As opposed to leagues like Liga or La Liga, But yeah, for me it's Dortmund, but backed up by many other clubs. But at number 4 we have Brazil, the Brasileirão. I love Brazil for football shirts. It was one of the first videos I did on this channel. I was talking about Umbro, making some great shirts in Brazil. But the league as a whole has always been one that I've looked to for football shirts. I was trying to think what I love about Brazil ahead of this video. And I can't think of a name for this design, but it's the shirts that have stripes with pinstripes in addition. Teams like Fluminense and Grêmio have really kind of pioneered this. Someone like Grêmio with their light blue and black stripes, but the white pinstripes as well, framing those stripes. Again, I can't think of what to call that. I've mentioned this before in other videos too. I just love that aesthetic. Fluminense, another club who do this really well, and there's others in Brazil too. To me, that look, again with stripes and pinstripes, or stripes framed in pinstripes, that's just so quintessentially Brazilian, and it looks so good. Sao Paulo, another club, and there's many others too. I also have a bit of a fondness for Corinthian shirts, and again, particularly in the modern game, I'd say Corinthians have had some of the best designs, or certainly some of the most collectible. Something like the Senna shirt really highlighted that, I would say, in my eyes. It's a great league for shirts. I think it's funny having Brazil this high compared to someone like Argentina, both South American leagues, but I think Brazil just have a bit more consistency. It's a bit less top heavy, I would say, in my eyes, compared to someone like Argentina. So I'm really kind of planting my flag in that rivalry, aren't I? But I do really rate Brazil. And yeah, if you're not convinced, check out Umbro in Brazil. Bit of a cliche on this channel, but if you look at the last few years, what Umbro have done, some of the collections they've released, again, a bit like Charlie in Mexico, when you look at Umbro and their work in Brazil, they put great effort into not just one or two clubs, but all the clubs they work with. And some of the collections, just from a colour and pattern perspective, are wonderful. They've even snuck in a few retro designs for things like keeper kits. Brazil is great, guys. If you're a collector, you should be picking up some Brazilian shirts. So there's only 3 leagues to go. And in bronze position, we have the Premier League. Now, the Premier League is probably the biggest league in the world, if we're talking about, again, viewership and things like that. But it's also one of the best leagues in the world for football shirts, in my eyes. And I really do think you have to look at the whole picture as well, not just one particular era. It's the consistency. I should say at this point that when I say the Premier League, I'm talking about England's top division at the time. So we're going to be talking about a few shirts pre-1992 when the Premier League started. And that's true of all the divisions I've talked about. If they've had a rebrand or they've changed their name, you can just consider I'm talking about the top division in the league. But yeah, pre-Premier League era, so pre-early 90s, we had some amazing designs. Teams like Liverpool and Manchester United. And I actually really rate Manchester United's snowflake design. I'm a Liverpool fan, but I have so much appreciation for this particular Manchester United shirt. It's one of those Adidas designs which has stood the test of time, which is continually being referred to because it was a seminal moment in football shirts. And later in the 90s, we had designs like the bruised banana, which again were hated and vilified at the time, but have gone on to represent that golden era of football shirts. There's a reason Adidas keep trying to resurrect the bruised banana shirt and the snowflake shirts, because they're so popular. And rightly so in my eyes. Those shirts are iconic. But moving on slightly to the noughties, I used to love Arsenal shirts growing up. Even though I was a Liverpool fan again, I look to Arsenal shirts and Nike's work with Arsenal and just be really jealous. From the Total 90 designs to the maroon shirt that they had to commemorate Highbury. But I loved that more simplistic era that we saw. And there is a lot of nostalgia as well. That was the era when I was watching a lot of football and really obsessed and becoming obsessed with football shirts. I think it's a tricky league to kind of judge actually as a collector. Many collectors, if you're like me in the UK, will be quite selective with their clubs, their English clubs, and they might say, you know, only collect shirts from their club in England. I think sometimes if you take a step back and try and look at things quite objectively, if that's possible with football shirts. I know many people say it isn't. I think it is possible. But anyway, if we try and take a step back, you can see some great designs, and even from your rival teams or teams that you're competing with in the week, from a shirt perspective, you can see great things. So I really rate, again, things like Chelsea's kits. A lot of recent Chelsea kits, I think, have been really interesting. I loved the recent Chelsea third shirt we saw a few years ago. That was my favourite of the collection that Nike did, which were retro-inspired, and I really liked that black and orange shirt that Chelsea had, and there's been others as well. But yeah, I really think the Premier League deserves a top 3 spot here. But this is another one which I think will be quite controversial. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Whether you're based in the UK or not, I'd really like to know what you think of the Premier League full shirts. I really think it is good. To paraphrase Jose Mourinho, this is football heritage, or football shirt heritage, I should say. The Premier League is where you'll find many designs which will continue to be referenced for good reason. But yeah, when it comes to football shirts, the Premier League has to be up there in my eyes. And now for the top 2. What's left in this countdown? We're going to go to Japan and we're going to talk about J-League. I absolutely adore the Japanese league for shirts, and I think particularly for me it's the colours of J-League. If you look at 90s J-League or even modern J-League as well, you've got absolutely everything on the colour spectrum, and I love that. You've got pinks and purples and greens and oranges and blues and light blues and reds and everything in one league. I think many leagues are a little bit kind of one-dimensional when it comes to their colour palette, but J-League is the exact opposite. You've got absolutely everything and some. You've got the crazy sponsors, which I quite like. I mentioned that in the Liga MX section. And you've got amazing sponsors, amazing patterns. If we talk about 90s J-League, of course, that is really the highlight. And there's so many interesting clubs. I mean, I used to love as well, like the club crests and team names. They had quite an exciting element to them. But yeah, it was the shirts, guys. Things like Shimizu S-Pulse, giant maps on their shirts. How good is that? Or what about the Jeff United Sega shirts? Incredibly collectible. Some of these shirts, some JD shirts, are incredibly sought after, even more so than other leagues that we've already talked about. And I think like the majority of the leagues that have been on this list, it's not just one era, it's consistency. It's looking at things like the noughties and seeing some of the best designs from Nike and Adidas in Japan. All looking at, again, the modern game. We talked about theme shirts for a couple of countries, and in Japan you'll see some really interesting shirts that celebrate seasons and festivals and even some more random occasions. You've got absolutely everything from a shirt perspective. But yeah, J-League shirts, incredibly collectible. I think often because they're quite hard to find as well sometimes. Again, speaking as a UK collector, when you see some of the prices of J-League shirts, it's quite hard. Even if you know people in Japan who can send it on, it's not easy to collect a lot of J-League shirts. I think that adds to the kind of aura around collecting. I think that's why many collectors look to the J-League. It's not just the designs, but it's the fact that it's actually quite hard to get hold of them. You've got to find a really good deal on eBay, or maybe you've just got to bide your time and, again, know the right people. And there's that kind of thrill of the hunt, I think, with J-League shirts, more than there is with most other world leagues. But I'd love to know your favourite J-League shirts. This is one thing which I think many of us will agree on. I hope we will anyway. Let me know your favourite J-League shirts. If you own any J-League shirts, I think it is kind of the rite of passage for pretty much any collector, I think, to have at least one, I would say. Japan, though, is just incredible for football shirts, guys. It deserves its reputation as one of the best in the world. But it isn't number one, because number one is Serie A. I'm sure many of you predicted this would happen. Serie A is incredible in so many ways. I think we mentioned heritage when it came to the Premier League. I think you could ramp that up even more with Serie A from a football shirt perspective. You think of the red and black stripes of AC Milan, or the blue and black stripes of Inter Milan, the purple of Fiorentina, the giallorossi of Roma. Again, this isn't just about the retro aesthetic as well. We're not just talking about the 80s and 90s. I think in the modern game, Serie A is really interesting from a shirt perspective. I loved, for example, Inter Milan's collection a couple of seasons ago. That, to me, was one of the best modern collections of kits we've ever seen. And there's just so much, again, throughout Italy. It is so stacked when it comes to football shirts. Look at Fiorentina, look at the Battistuta era, look at the 7-Up shirts and the Nintendo shirts. And I've not even mentioned Parma, one of my personal favourite clubs when it comes to shirts. The champion Parma era was incredible. I think that moment, that late 90s, early noughties period for Parma was outstanding. One of the best club brand collaborations we've ever seen. For me, it's every brand really as well. It's not just one particular brand which have excelled there. You've got everyone doing some of their best work in Italy, and it's the heritage especially. It's seeing some of those old Milan shirts and just being in awe. If I could only collect shirts from one league, I would choose Italy. As much as I love Brazil and Japan and some of these other leagues, I think Serie A is the place to be for football shirts, and that's true of any era. It really is wonderful. And that is a wrap. That is our top 10 list, guys. I'd really like to know your feedback. What is your top 10? Are there any leagues that I should have mentioned? Are there any leagues which should have been much higher on the list or much lower on the list? Do you collect shirts from a particular league? I'd love to hear from you. And on your way out, don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and also to leave a comment. I'll respond to my favourite comments at the start of the next video. But that is my top 10 leagues in the world for football shirts. These are the places I would go to for football shirts as a collector. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you soon for another video here at Phil's Corner.